He baffled him. He was afraid the public would mistake the new movie for having to do with a card game, and he refused to allow that title to be used.
Just before release, Universal changed the title of The Pinnacle to Blind Husbands. Von Stroheim was furious and published a bitter attack on the studio in the Motion Picture News.
Carl Laemmle answered it the next week. It was the first of many quarrels between von Stroheim and his producers. But for the present, it was just good publicity.
Blind Husbands was a tremendous hit. Critics were astounded by the mature handling of the cliched triangle situation and the film's dramatic sense of realism. Some even thought it had been photographed in Europe. Von Stroheim was starting his career at the top. By the time Blind Husbands was released, he had already completed his second film, The Devil's Passkey. The setting was Paris, the world of high fashion, and the Comédie Française. Again, he told a story of Americans in post-war Europe and of a neglected wife involved with a handsome officer. This time, the officer was an American, and the critics were outraged. But most agreed it was a significant advance from Blind Husbands, with greater subtlety and imagination. Today, there is no way of knowing. In 1941, the original negative was found to have disintegrated in studio vaults, and no prints are known to survive.
One day, Mr. Laemmle came to Erich and he said, "Why don't you make a picture about gambling?" So Erich had never been to Monte Carlo, but he said, well, that would be a good place to have the background. He built the whole Monte Carlo on the Universal lot. It was the talk of the town.
The production of Foolish Wives was a turning point in Hollywood history. The film established Universal as a major studio and branded von Stroheim as an uncontrollable spendthrift. It was called the first $1 million picture. Like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, von Stroheim was fascinated by the post-war phenomenon of the American in Europe. The foolish American wife, caught between a husband who cares only for business and a charming European rogue, discovers the flaws and virtues of each culture. The European may be glamorous, but also inherently deceptive and decadent. Von Stroheim sought to make this clear through his portrayal of Karamzin, a bogus Russian count whose taste in women is unhindered by American-style morality. While trying to seduce the American ambassador's wife, he is also involved with two so-called cousins, his serving maid, and the mentally retarded daughter of an old counterfeiter. Von Stroheim began in July of 1920. 11 months later, he had shot over 60 hours of film. The production was a nightmare. Von Stroheim constantly rewrote the script and often filmed dozens of takes of the same scene. Irving Thalberg, now production head at Universal, could only sit back and watch as von Stroheim meticulously put his fantasies on screen.
He was such a stickler for detail. There was a scene where they ate caviar. Well, in those days, they would put some raspberry jam in a dish, not von Stroheim. It had to be real caviar. I will know, he says, when I eat it, it's real caviar.
It was really Thalberg's baptism of fire with von Stroheim. There was a budget, there was a schedule, and von Stroheim blithely ignored them both. He liked to embroider his films as he went along. And as a consequence, when Thalberg tried to hold him down, von paid no attention. He just brushed him off. Von simply said, look, take me off as a director, remove me, and he removed me as a star. You won't have a film. Thalberg, therefore, was totally ineffectual in any fight, and he had to agree. And I will say that Foolish Wives turned out very well. It was very costly, took a long time, created lots of problems, but it came off so well There's an old axiom, everything is forgiven if you have a good preview. Von had a very good preview.
But despite good business in the big cities, many were shocked by the film's brutal realism and its unflattering portrait of Americans. The film became a target for censors across the country, and just after its premiere, an entire hour was cut from it. Foolish Wives, and especially von Stroheim's notorious Count, soon became a national scandal. A favorite target of censors and pressure groups, it also became the butt of a Mack Sennett comedy starring Ben Turpin. But Ben Turpin's antics had little effect on von Stroheim, who was already deep into his next project.
Von Stroheim was preparing a film which had an Austrian background. It was called The Merry-Go-Round. He had found a girl in Chicago who had won a beauty contest, Mary Philbin, and he had selected her to play the lead in it. And Norman Carey, who looked the prototype of an Austrian officer, played the lead. So he rebuilt parts of Vienna. It was fabulous how he really copied the Prater, the famous entertainment park.
With Hollywood's millions, von Stroheim rebuilt the Vienna of his youth in lavish detail.
But this time, Irving Thalberg refused to allow him to act as well as direct. Foolish Wives had taught him that lesson. Instead, Norman Carey had been given the role von Stroheim had intended for himself, and Thalberg sent spies to watch the progress of the shooting. What they saw was a Vienna of corrupt sensuality and its nobility in the last stages of decay. Von Stroheim spent weeks filming these bedroom scenes, and as costs mounted, Thalberg began to receive warning signals.
When Merry-Go-Round was starting, Thalberg wanted von Stroheim to very carefully note that there were to be no added scenes. And I'm sure that Thalberg thought that Von would take that to heart, but he wasn't the type who would. He was enough of a perfectionist that he wasn't going to be bound by things that he thought would hamper the perfection of his film. As soon as Thalberg saw that, they had a furious fight. Von Stroheim decided to take his case to Carl Laemmle, who was in New York. Thalberg had another director on the lot, Rupert Julian, and while von Stroheim was on a train chugging its way across country, Thalberg put the picture right into production with Carey and Julian. And it began to roll very well, so much so that when von Stroheim reached Carl Laemmle in New York, confident that his mentor would back him up, Laemmle had already decided, or did decide almost immediately, that he would back Thalberg. And Von was in a spot. I mean, he had put himself in such a spot that it was either, you either do as I say or I quit. And he quit.
When the film was released, von Stroheim's name was nowhere on the credits, and only a few of his scenes were still in the picture. but they were pure von Stroheim. Von Stroheim's break with Universal shocked the entire industry. Never before had a studio so ruthlessly exercised its power over a major director. But other studios quickly rushed in with offers. Within weeks, he had signed with the Goldwyn Company and begun work on an adaptation of McTeague, Frank Norris's classic novel. He called it Greed. In Frank Norris, von Stroheim found an ally, a writer whose passion for realism matched his own. He became obsessed with the book and determined to capture every detail. Before this, his films had looked back to the Europe of his youth. Now, the subject was his adopted country, America. Von Stroheim had come to New York in 1909, leaving Austria for reasons never fully explained. With little money and no command of the language, he was only one more immigrant out of many millions. But in this new world, he would not be just plain Erich Stroheim. Already his imagination had created a new identity and a title to go with it. At Ellis Island, he presented himself as Erich Oswald Hans Karl Maria von Stroheim. Von Stroheim may have gained a title, but his hopes were limited. He hung around the fringes of New York's German colony, taking whatever odd jobs he could. He enlisted as a private in New York's National Guard, but was dropped from the rolls 2 months later. Finally, he landed a job as a salesman for Max Grab, an importer of fabrics and laces. He worked for a time in their New York offices and soon was made a traveling salesman. In 1912, he arrived in San Francisco. A gold rush boomtown disguised as a graceful European capital, San Francisco appealed to von Stroheim, who was still claiming to be a European nobleman. He lost his job with Max Grab, but stayed working at a variety of odd jobs. In the summer of 1912, he was a waiter and handyman at the West Point Inn on Mount Tamalpais. Here he met Margaret Knox, daughter of a prominent Oakland family. He quickly dazzled her with tales of his noble ancestry, and they were married a few months later. They lived down the block from Margaret's family on Oakland's 14th Street. In this modest rooming house, von Stroheim perfected his English and began to write. But there was little interest in his work, and he was still compelled to take odd jobs. After 2 years, the marriage began to deteriorate. Von Stroheim left town looking for work, and Margaret sued for divorce.
6 months later, he was in Hollywood, working for D.W. Griffith. To film Greed, von Stroheim returned to San Francisco in 1923, leaving the studio far behind. He built no sets. McTeague's dental parlor was in this building, still standing on the corner of Hayes and Laguna. Von Stroheim felt that for the scenes to seem real, they had to be real. The actors worked in the rooms by day and slept in them at night. This rare footage shows von Stroheim directing a screen test of Jean Hersholt, and acting out the part himself while a group of musicians provide a musical accompaniment.
The entire cast had to submit to tests like this.